family patterns will have a huge impact on us. But what has an even bigger impact is the order that we're born into the family. Whether we're the youngest, the middle, the eldest, it all has a psychological impact that we then think it's a part of our personality, but it's not. It's just the order that we're born into the family. So if we start with the eldest child, oftentimes the eldest child being the first, mother's never been pregnant before, everything's happening that's new with her body. If she doesn't have a strong support system of elder women that can say, oh, we've done this before, let's guide you, support you, or love in partnership, that child will tend to have most of mom's nervousness, most of mom's uncertainty, insecurities, that sort of stuff. But what even impacts the eldest child even more is when they're born, they're the only one into the family. So they're not a part of a team as such. And so they get a lot of attention, a lot of focus is on the eldest child at first. But often what happens is as soon as the other children are born, suddenly the eldest child gets pushed aside with bigger expectations. For example, you're too big to be crying. You need to help mommy. So there's a sense of having to be more responsible, more perfect. So they tend to aim for perfection, and that the only way they often get praised in the family is if they do really well. And so they get the praise and they're also setting a good example for the others. Whereas when the other children are born, they come into a team structure. They know that there's other children, so they're part of a team. And they're allowed to have personality traits that might be a bit naughty. For example, the other children or the babies, they can have tantrums, they can lose their things. And suddenly it's like, okay, the eldest child, you have to help the younger ones find their things. You have to help mommy look after them. So there's a heightened sense of responsibility that can cause a huge amount of stress for the eldest child. And so if they're not driven to seek perfection and be very good and very, actually they're very hypercritical of themselves. So in this duality system, the eldest child will tend to focus a lot on things being this or that, rather than the diversity of them being both this and that. And so because of the extra stresses on that eldest child to perform, they tend to be hypercritical of themselves, which really branches out to life and others in general, or quite judgmental. And so how the eldest child gets their stress relief when they're older is they're the ones that often fall off the wagon or fall into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or fall into addiction or anything like that. And that's primarily as a stress relief. And what will happen is when they fall off and go into things that, ordinarily they would have a judgment about or think others do because it means they're not perfect, then they'll flip back to perfection. So there'll be this, I've got to be really perfect and do the right thing. And then there's like that stress relief, well, I'm into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or, whatever escapism that they need as a stress relief. So they tend to fluctuate between being quite divided, actually, in the perfection and then knowing within themselves that they're not perfect. The other children, when they're born, they come in, as I said, as a part of a team. So they have a little bit more freedom to express themselves. And with the middle child, they used to be known as the lost child because they were kind of left on their own, and they're the people pleasers. They're the ones that want the family to all get along, because as the middle child, they're too big for this and they're not big enough for that. So they tend to have a lot of independence in not feeling a part of the family or supported. So they tend to be able to step back and see the family for what it is. And so they want everyone to get along. So they can see what's going on with the older, they can see what's going on with the younger. And so they tend to be more of the observers. And by people pleaser, I mean that they want everyone to get along. It's like, why don't we do things this way? Why don't we get along? Because they want to get along with the older, and they do, and they want to get along with the younger. And so being known in the past anyway as the lost child was simply because they didn't really have a position in the family. But what I've come to discover as a middle child myself is that it's a power position in the family. because you learn to observe, you learn to see how things are. There's not as much pressure on you to perform as the eldest ones, and you have a little bit more freedom than the younger ones. So anyhow, if we move on to the youngest child knows that everyone's going to look after them. It's like, come on, pick the baby up, help the baby, get the baby's shoes. So the eldest child has the time, sorry, not the eldest, the youngest child has the time to fantasize a lot, to daydream, to not be quite as responsible. So they're allowed a certain amount of creativity and freedom that the others don't have. And so when you think of those things, those actually make us believe that this is my personality rather than, well, this is the psychology of the position I am in the family. Now, what will happen with the eldest child, and sometimes they'll abdicate the position to the next eldest, but with the eldest child, if mother's needs are not being met, if she's a single mother or doesn't have great support system, let's just say dad's on the road a lot, or he's a workaholic, or he's not emotionally available, what will happen with the eldest child is they'll step into the role of being mum's husband, not physically, but in the sense of, I got to make sure mum's okay. I've got to make sure mum's needs are met. Because if mum's needs aren't met, then everything's chaos. My life is unstable. So imagine for a moment that mother is a single mother, quite stressed, or dad's an alcoholic or something like that. So what will happen with the eldest child is, for example, let's say they're bullied at school or they've had a bad day and they want to come home and get a bit of cuddles. Well, if they come home and they see that mum's not emotionally available because stuff's going on in her head, in her life, what the eldest child will do is put their needs aside so that let's make sure mummy's okay, because so long as mummy's okay, then we know that we will survive and everything's fine. So the eldest child tends to be quite mature in one sense for their age, or looking at things always from a hyper responsible position. And as I said, if the eldest child abdicates that position, then of course the next eldest steps in, because what children want more than anything is to know that they're safe, that their life is stable. In other words, they can depend on the house and the roof being over their head when they wake up. They can depend on mommy and daddy being there, and that the house is going to have food or things that creates the ordinary survival needs. And so with the middle child, as I mentioned, as the people pleaser, they're the ones that will make the adjustments in the family or be willing to. They often can be the black sheep of the family in the sense of they wonder, how did I get in this family? I have nothing in common with anyone. And the black sheep used to be thought of in medical thinking and psychological thinking as the troubled child or the one that has problems. But that's not the true definition of the black sheep. The black sheep is the one that wants things to be different. They want to change the status quo, whereas other family members might think, let's just stay in the family dynamic trance of this is just the way it is and make no changes, because if we have to make changes, that means we have to change something about ourselves. So the middle child tends to be more adaptable. They can fit in with lots of different situations, types of people, lifestyles, because they're adaptable, they're flexible. The eldest child tends to be a little bit more rigid, a little bit more focused on doing the right thing. And the youngest child can be the dreamer, can be the, I don't need to take full responsibility for things because I know mum's going to rescue me, or my sister or my brother, or I can be needy in different ways. And so that is always going to be a part of the soul's plans anyway. But while we're in the body, we don't realize that. All we know is this is how we think, and this is how we feel, and this is how things are in our family. So besides the birth order affecting us from a psychological perspective, family patterns will as well. And so oftentimes we think, well, I'm just like my dad, or I'm just like my mom. But what we don't realize is that it's conditioned beliefs passed down through generations. So for example, it's not just your mother and your father that has the influence on your beliefs. It's that whole structural generation on the mother's side and the father side in how they believe, things that they think, how they perceive life. In fact, you usually find it's not until maybe 2 years after leaving home that suddenly you realize the world's a whole different place than what I've been brought up to believe. Because within those 2 years, approximately 2 years, we run into a whole range of different people that think differently, that perceive the world differently. And it's like there's a whole different world out there that we wouldn't initially realize because we would have been conditioned to being, this is how life is. And all of those things are part of the soul's plans, always. And a part of our challenge as the individual is to discover, why do we have this foundation? Why have we come into this family structure? And it's never all bad. We focus on the negative things, but it's not. So things within the family are not meant to necessarily be rejected. A lot of things are meant to be absorbed and seen for the value of it. And another thing with the family patterns that affects and influence us is that oftentimes we can think and feel that this is exactly true for me, but it's not. It's just like putting on a pair of glasses that says, this is how we view the world, and therefore this is how the world is. And when you go into your own subconscious or you do deep self-exploration, which is always an inner thing, it's like taking off the glasses and you see the world differently. So if I were to describe it symbolically, it's like, imagine for a moment that your mind is a city and all that's lit up is your neighborhood. So you can happily go up and down your neighborhood all day long, and that's fine because that's all you know. And then imagine that one day the whole city is lit up and you're just like, oh my God, there's all different types of food and people and buildings and streets and ways of doing things that was so foreign to you, but it's there, it's a part of life. It's just that you've been only hanging in your neighborhood. So that neighborhood is like the neural pathways in your brain, the streets and avenues, and they're the comfort zone. It's what I know, what I think, what I believe. And then when you light up your whole brain, as in you access the totality of human experiences, you can see that there's many different ways of doing and experiencing life. Now, the worst case scenario about your neighborhood is if you are suffering from long-term stress, what we would call PTSD. It's not only that PTSD happens because of a shocking moment in time, or you're in war or some shocking immediate violence. It can happen through childhood stresses. And what that is like, symbolically, it's like I'm on a one-way system, I'm on a loop. I just can't get off of that loop. And so the ways to break those patterns, or one of the ways, is to interrupt the pattern. And that I can talk about at another time. But everything about life is fractals. And with fractals, it's like patterns and things repeat in themselves, and then they might mutate and have slight changes. So if you think about yourself for a moment, as a human being, you are a fractal of your parents. That's why we have their ways, their looks, their perceptions, because it's like that pattern of who I am as a parent is now passed down in my children. With their own free will choices, they will make slight changes, but you will see that we're fractals of our parents, and therefore patterns and themes are a part of how consciousness operates. And with the patterns and themes, some of them have great value, and some of them are ones that we want to have closure on, or we need to end because it's creating a repetitiveness in our life that we don't like. For example, I'm attracted to the same type of men all the time, or I always get this type of a boss, or people always talk to me that way. And so what that would suggest to you is that you're in a construct of energy fields that are connected to other things, whether good or bad. And so one of the ways of seeing what those things are is to, of course, go into deep self-exploration. And always when we go into our own inner knowing, that's where the true answers are. because with our conscious mind, which is the everyday surface layer of our mind, it's not designed to access the deeper parts of us. It's simply designed to keep us living physically. So it's always a linear outward looking thing or aspect of ourselves. And what we call the subconscious is all the layers beneath the conscious mind's awareness. So if we use the analogy of the body as being representing symbolically consciousness, the skin would be the conscious mind, which is just the surface layer. It's designed to keep us safe, no infections, so that we can thrive in life. And being as it's the skin, it's always looking outwards. But really, it's an interface for the outer world and the inner world. And it knows absolutely nothing about how the body functions, the bloodstream, any of that. So the conscious mind knows absolutely nothing about what's going on under the surface. However, our body holds the symptoms of every single thing we've ever experienced. Even though our mind might forget the importance of a moment in time, it is registered and anchored into our body. And so our bodies are actually quite amazing. We usually don't like them. We usually have a lot of judgment about our body. And what that does is that it keeps us from being present. It keeps us from being grounded. It keeps us from being comfortable in our own skin. And that I'll touch on in another video.